to note first and foremost that the idea that informed the proposed African financial architecture is one which derived from an attempt following all of the struggles for independence, the end of apartheid, to push an agenda of an African renaissance, in which, as you mentioned, Jason, the African continent would be able more effectively to exercise agency, as it were, occupy the driver's seat in both the setting of priorities for its development and also managing the implementation of its development agenda. And in the discussions in the early 90s, which led ultimately to the dissolution of the old OAU and the emergence of the African Union, it was clear that the question of Africa's economic liberation, as it was put, which effectively would amount to the second liberation of the continent, was topmost in the thinking of many of us as scholars, as activists, as Pan-Africanists, as well as at least a critical mass of the generation of African leaders who oversaw the transition from the OAU to the AU. And indeed, in the first few years of the coming on stream of the AU, we saw an activist engagement, certainly at the level of the African Union Commission, specifically the old Department of Economic Affairs, in quickly beginning to give flesh and content to the African financial architecture as embodied in the Abuja Treaty. Three key components of that architecture: the African Central Bank, the African Monetary Fund, and the African Investment Bank. And so what I would like to say from the outset is that in many respects, the conceptualization of the African financial architecture, even though it had all kinds of economic and financial justifications underpinning it, was in fact primarily first and foremost a political project that was tied to the goal of strengthening the autonomy and autochthony of African economies in the context of a rapidly changing world. And all of this informed also by some of the terribly unhappy experiences associated with structural adjustment, including humiliating conditionality and cross-conditionality clauses, which effectively, as our keynote speaker observed, compelled African countries to embrace programs which, indeed, for many countries, they knew in their hearts of hearts, really never were capable of addressing the problems that confronted them, and being packed into a corner in which getting a clean bill of health from the Bretton Woods institutions, in whose councils they had very little or no effective decision-making role, and certainly in terms of the quota system of the IMF, African voices, not only marginal, but minuscule, in a very literal sense. It was clear that the political goal of ensuring that Africa is able to be the driver of its own destiny was an important element, a key driving element of the move towards the architecture, even if many other economic considerations could also be adduced that informed why such an architecture would make sense. So my key point from the outset is that at the heart of the architecture was a political consideration, consideration that spoke to the configuration of power in the international economic financial system and the ways in which Africa could effectively win space for itself and build an institutional mechanism that could serve as a bulwark for the renegotiation of aspects of the asymmetries of power in the international economic system. And I think as the first decade of the new millennium wore on, and all of the consultations which were convened across the continent around the key institutions of the financial architecture, what their shape could be like, what their mandate could be, and their governance structure. Sadly, I would say that we quickly, I think, forgot about the overarching political strategic considerations that underpinned the conceptualization of the architecture and became effectively reduced to a discussion of technical and technicist minutiae of a kind which effectively began to slow momentum and ultimately to create some loss of appetite and traction in the movement towards the launching of the architecture. To be sure, of course, the documents informing that would underpin the establishment of the three key institutions were completed, beginning with the central bank, followed by the investment bank and the monetary fund, and more recently, a timeline for their implementation. One of them is actually supposed to come into effect in 2023, was established within the framework of Agenda 2060 of the African Union. Effectively, we have seen a loss of momentum in spite of all of these progress at the technical level in terms of operationalizing the three institutions for various reasons. And I'll argue that one of them is the fact, which we would see also in comparative terms as having played out with regard to the proposal to set up an Asia Monetary Fund following the East Asian financial crisis of 97, 98, is the fact that we have significantly underestimated the fact that there are powerful forces in the international system that not only feel themselves entitled to Africa, but are determined to put as many obstacles in the way of the actualization of the architecture as we have proposed as they can muster, including working through partners, clients, and various other mechanisms that are already embedded in the African world. And that underestimation speaks to the fact that even the preparatory work that was undertaken for these three institutional mechanisms to come on stream was mostly underwritten, not by African funding, but by funding mobilized by the AU from external partners, who in turn also had a right of attendance and participation in discussions around some of the technicalities that would inform the functioning of the three institutions. Effectively, therefore, further reinforcing the sense of a technicist approach to the making of the institutions and to that extent blunting their political, overarching political purpose in terms of regaining control over our developmental agenda and the institutional drivers of the mechanism. And in order for us, I think, to begin to...
Sorry, Professor Olukoshi, if I may ask...
Over the,
may ask if I could just ask you to wrap up in about a minute or so we can bring in Lucky Star as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm doing that. In order for us to regain control over the agenda towards the establishment of the architecture, it seems to me that it is important that some key principles must be brought back to the fore. Amongst them, very quickly, I'll mention the need to emphasize that there must be a complete African ownership and management of the institutions, that they be imbued with a developmental agenda. And therefore, from that point of view, the concern which has been expressed, particularly with the monetary fund, that they should not simply be reduced to clones of the IMF, for example, or indeed of the World Bank. In this regard also, I think it is important that we begin to identify key champions, as has been done with other areas of continental work, that will be the political bearers of the agenda in a context in which, at least so far, much of the work for advocating and pushing for the launching of the architecture, ratification, adoption of all of the agreements that have been put in place has been largely left to the Commission in the absence of champions amongst political leaders who can ensure that the architecture remains an important part of the summit of the AU, and therefore something which is seen as an urgent intervention for the sake of re-establishing our dignity. I'll leave it at this, Chair, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first.